Hello everyone, I'm Rupert van der Velde, and today we're going to be looking at a condition that will affect most street photographers on a fairly regular basis, especially so if you live here in the UK, and that is grey sky syndrome. I can imagine a lot of viewers are nodding in agreement at this. Well, for me as a photographer, there is little more dispiriting sight than to see the sun slip behind the clouds with no sign of it reappearing, to be left with a blanket of grey where everything just looks bland. It would even be better if it started to pour down, because at least then there are reflective surfaces and more variations in the light. You might say to yourself, that's fine. If the weather isn't right, I'll just wait for a better day. You just have to be a little patient and I'll soon be photo walking again. Well, firstly, we don't all have the freedom to manage our time in such a way. And anyway, how many times have you been out shooting when suddenly the weather turns sour just as you are getting into it? Well, what I'm going to be looking at in this video is how we can maximise our opportunities in these conditions, and not only how we can make the best of poor lighting, but how we can turn it to our advantage. Of course, you can just double down and go full on bleak, and we'll be looking at some examples of this. But for the main part, I want to look at how we can brighten the mood. We'll look at 5 key points that will hopefully get you thinking about not only what you can look for in these conditions, but how you should look at it. In my book, Fine Art Street Photography, I talk about why I generally choose to shoot in black and white. From deep blacks to bright whites and all the many shades in between, the monochrome palette makes us look at and consider our world differently. It has an emotional effect that is very different to that of colour. A scene with washed out colours and no vibrancy will generally lack any real presence. But by thinking in black and white and considering where your tonal range will be, you can immediately start to judge where your highlights, your shadows, and your main focus should be. Suddenly those uninspiring, dreary colours become smoothly blending shades of grey with graphic possibilities. There was nothing much to this scene in the original colour. It was just flat and uninteresting, and no part of the image stood out. By converting it to black and white, it took on a new look built around the 3 main tones of the monochrome scale: white, mid-grey and black. Almost like a colour wheel. The passerby is a point of focus and brings perspective to the image. This time, shooting down on a stairway, there is a wide tonal range from pure white to deep black, and each tone adds an element of interest that helps to highlight details such as in the stonework, the man's face, and his raincoat. Because there is a marked difference right across the tonal range, each area of the image has a presence and an energy to it. In this image from Russian-born photographer Alexei Titarenko's City of Shadows series from the early 1990s, he doubles down on the mood and uses a slow shutter speed to create a dreamlike quality, blurring the movement of people and objects in the busy streets. The effect is in keeping with the bleakness of the mood. Terrific overhead shot here from Elliot Erwitt, using the geometry of the road markings to great effect. The tiny black figure appears so strong in the composition and is tonally balanced by the black wall at the top of the picture. Imagine this one in colour, if you can. This point is a big one. One way to bring life to your pictures on a dull day is by using contrast. By maximising the lightest and darkest parts of your composition, you will create standout areas and focal points that will help to establish the tones in between. When shooting on grey days, I'm always on the lookout for bright whites, as this is often the starting point for a picture. That's just my style, and that isn't to say that a flatter, smoother look doesn't work just as well. Slightly different type of shot from me, but a good example of finding brightness and contrast in more unusual places. The light was soft and these kitchen workers had just finished a cigarette break and were heading back inside. I wanted to take their picture, but they weren't gathered in an interesting way when smoking, so I followed them to see if I could capture them elsewhere. They had to wait a few moments for the lift, so it gave me an opportunity. Love this image from Melissa Breyer, which has a mysterious daydream feel to it. The neon sign is a nice addition, and along with the apron and cloth is a punchy contrast to the deep blacks and monochrome palette. It's a great example of contrasting tones in more subdued light. Paul Trevor's white dog against the dilapidated boarding in this shot taken in London's East End in the 1970s is a great use of contrast. It's an image that sums up that part of London at the time perfectly and shows us how a picture can be built around a subject or focal point that is only a small part of the overall composition. This super image from Robert Doisneau is a good example of using contrast with the bright floor tiles and the pure black of the dog. There is also a contrast between the strong form and alert pose of the dog against the more relaxed mood of the man in the background. Of course, colour can work too, and the primary colours of red, blue and green add punch to this great scene from Fred Herzog. Another way to enhance the contrast in your images is to shoot from within a darker area out into where the light is coming from. Typical examples of this would be under a bridge or walkway, or from inside a shop or building. In this image, even though it was a dull day, because I was shooting from a dark area under a bridge, the light coming in appears much stronger than it actually was. The light is actually quite soft, but it still highlights the detail in the road surface and picks out the brickwork well. I exposed for the brightest area and went for the smallest aperture I could get, whilst getting a shutter speed high enough to freeze the moving figure. Overcast conditions don't always mean the light is going to be dull and unrewarding. There are some very soft shadows here, and again the lighter ground areas and columns provide contrast as well as some interest. Gianni Berengo Gardin shoots out into the mist to create some fine shapes from the silhouettes of the Tuscan monks. The mist probably conceals an otherwise intrusive background, which, if visible, would change the whole mood of the picture. This is an example where the weather conditions play into our hands. Reflective surfaces are not just great ways to bring life to your pictures when it's bright or wet, but they can be used effectively in more dull or overcast conditions too. They will have a more subtle effect, but can do wonders in helping to lift an image out of the doldrums. The light coming off the cladding on these buildings is enough to add a luminous quality to the otherwise rather dull atmosphere. It helps to bring a little extra presence to the ground area, and along with the structural lines, helps lead our eyes to the unseen space that the figure is walking towards. Paradoxically, a stronger light on a much brighter day might be a bit too much and would definitely change the dynamic of the picture. I suppose the image has a slightly dystopian feel to it, which I like. If you're out and about and you get a sudden downpour, but the light remains dull afterwards, then using puddles can be a fun way to break up the gloom. We've all seen numerous examples of images made from reflections in rainwater. Let's face it, we've all done them and they can look very impressive, but they can also look a little hackneyed, to say the least. In this picture, I tried thinking a little differently and made the focus as much on the puddles themselves as on the figure in the scene. It's definitely a little experimental, but when the weather isn't fair, you have to think outside the box. Trust saw lighter to show us how to do colour on a darker day. Yes, there is some brightness in the sky, but look at the colour saturation he has achieved. The film stock will be aiding this, but he has seen the opportunity that's presented itself here with the colours and reflective surfaces of the damp roads and cars. Here, André Curtis uses a reflective surface in a different way. The frosted glass gives a little character to the silhouetted figure behind it to give a more abstract look. The composition is neatly divided up into sections and textures, with the grey sky conveying a sombre mood. Shooting up towards the sky and letting the light dictate terms is another useful trick when trying to bring more brightness and contrast to your pictures on a lousy weather day. Unless it's Armageddon time and there really is no hope for your photo walk, the sky will usually have some brightness even on a really dull day. You can try for silhouettes against the sky, whether from a low camera position or by just featuring objects in the lower part of the composition. Against a grey or white sky, look for bright colours that would give you that punch of vibrance. It doesn't take much to liven up a scene that is otherwise mired in the doldrums. Or you can try shooting down, as Ray Metzger has done here, in this marvellous abstract example. I like to include parts of the sky in more graphic ways if I can, such as in this shot taken in Paris, where the sky appears in a window-like opening in a somewhat threatening kind of way, hovering over the young child and her fragile umbrella. The child was accompanied by her mother, who was ahead of her, and I let her leave the frame before shooting. Also taken in Paris, it's always dull weather there whenever I visit. The sky area again appears as a brooding reminder of the weather conditions. I like the building tilting forward slightly against the figure, who is walking in close proximity to it. There's a slightly menacing feel here. Shooting on grey days and in low light conditions forces us to think more creatively about our work and helps us to recognise opportunities that we might not have considered. Using the 5 points we've looked at here, you can begin to build an army of techniques that can come to your rescue when the sun hides away. Let me know your suggestions and what shooting tricks you employ on gloomy days in the comments. Check out my book Fine Art Street Photography on Amazon or on my website at www.rupertvandervelde.co.uk. Please subscribe if you're new here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.